Hello and welcome back. So we are moving on to another account of distributive justice today, a very influential one by Rawls, uh, his book, A Theory of Justice. So you may have noticed some similarities between Rawls' approach to distributive justice and Hobbes' social contract approach to morality. Um, it's a bit easier to apply social contract theory to the rules of society than sort of rules of morality more generally, right? Morality is a larger issue than how we should run, you know, how we should distribute goods, right? So the similarities are, like Hobbes, he thinks that an ideal system can be worked out by rational, um, self-interested beings uh, that work together each to their own interests that will eventually be to everyone's mutual interest. Um, but he's not making the Hobbes claim that this just is morality, right? So we don't get many of the same problems. Remember, one of the issues with Hobbes' theory was that since laws are also agreements by rational self-interested beings, it seemed like Hobbes' approach made morality and legality sort of synonymous, which meant that any form of civil disobedience would end up being immoral. But of course, some of our um, prototypes of moral behavior are people who engaged in civil disobedience, like Martin Luther King, and so you had to do a bit of work with Hobbes' theory to make it so that Martin Luther King Jr. was immoral. Rawls doesn't have that problem, right? He's just talking about a just distribution of goods. He's not trying to give an account of morality more generally. Um, he also gets around some of other of Hobbes' problems by the way he constructs situation where these rational self-interested beings are agreeing on these rules. We'll get into those details when we come to them. So Rawls calls his account justice as fairness. What he means by that is that he wants to construct a procedure, right, for constructing the rules, a fair one. And if the procedure is fair, then justice will result. So in that way, he's similar to Nozick, right? He's not saying sort of a priori, well, the most just system will be one that distributes things in this exact way, right? He doesn't have a pattern theory exactly. Instead, he has a procedure that he thinks will produce a just, right? Whatever the procedure happens to produce. And it might produce patterns, right? But they will all be just if they go through the procedure. Um, and so in that way, it's similar to Nozick's, right? It's sort of a historical, it's a process, and the process itself is a fair one, and so whatever it produces will be fair. So you'll recall in social contract theory, Hobbes described this sort of initial state that human beings are in, which is nature. Rawls has a starting point as well. He calls it the original position. Um, Now, even Hobbes' version of it was sort of a myth. We don't know if this, historical moment actually happened. Rawls is even more so, right? This is a hypothetical procedure, a hypothetical condition, right? That we can look at it as sort of a thought experiment that we can use to see what sort of procedure would produce, right? So he's not saying that this has ever happened in the past, or in fact, as we'll see, it's possible that it could happen even in reality, right? Because some of the conditions are sort of a little bit sci-fi. But nonetheless, if you use it as a thought experiment to see what sort of distribution would be produced, right, from the original position. So the key element of the original position, right? We have rational self-interested beings getting together to decide on what the rules will be and what the distribution of goods look like. Uh, the important difference with Hobbes is that Rawls puts everyone behind what he calls the veil of ignorance. What that veil of ignorance is, you don't know any of the details about yourself or your own life, right? Remember in Hobbes' theory, right? People are hammering out the rules they want, but these people are different, and so we saw the problem that people, right, or children, people that you can't sort of make a deal with that could benefit you, um, you're not going to want to give up any of your rights, a deal that would favor them. So social contract theory, Hobbes theory, ends up sort of trampling on minorities or oppressed groups, right? So the difference with Rawls is you have no idea whether you might be a member of one of those. Right? So for all you know, you might be a very wealthy CEO, right? Or might be a very poor wage worker, right? You might be a child in a sweatshop in Vietnam or something, right? You don't know if you're particularly strong or athletic. You don't know if you're particularly smart, whether you're good at music, architecture, whatever. You don't know if your parents are rich, poor, even alive. You don't know if you're the type of person who will get married and have kids or won't. You don't know anything about yourself, and again, in this hypothetical situation behind the veil of ignorance, you don't even know what sorts of things you value, right? Are you someone that is sort of a hedonist and seeks pleasure over all else, or are you a sort of person that believes that artistic achievement is the greatest end, right? So you know none of these details, right? Really, all you know is sort of what reason, the rationality, right, and are self-interested. So why does Rawls insist on this veil of ignorance uh, for the procedure in the original position? Well, maybe it's sort of obvious, right? If you knew that you were rich already, right, and you were trying to agree to a society that had rules to your advantage, you would probably want a society with low taxes, right? You wouldn't want a high tax rate. You want to be giving away millions of dollars in taxes. Again, you're purely self-interested. Remember, any sort of altruism does not enter into this uh, scenario, right? These are purely rational self-interest. So if you're a billionaire in the original position and you knew you were a billionaire, you would be seeking lower taxes, right? If you knew that you were poor and that needed help, you would probably try to construct a stronger safety net with larger, welfare programs and things like that, right? If you knew you were a hedonist and you only cared about pleasure, you would try to construct a society that maximized your pleasure and so on, right? But behind the veil of ignorance, you have to construct a society where you'll be as satisfied as possible no matter what you end up being, no matter where you fall on the socioeconomic ladder, once the veil is lifted, no matter what your particular talents or tastes are, right? So Rawls thinks this is the procedure that will come up with the most fair bargain, right? So everyone is basically equal, right, in that situation. They have no information that would distinguish them from any of the other human beings, and so they're going to come up with the fairest system for human beings, right, to live in. So this is why he calls this justice as fairness. He thinks that behind the veil of ignorance, you've got the most fairest possible uh, situation, right, uh, to haggle out the sort of society that you want to live in, the sort of distribution. Obviously, no actual society is constructed this way. The veil of ignorance is impossible, right? Like people's brains of everything but their rational faculties, right? And in reality, most of us don't even get to really come to the table. We get to vote, for our representatives. Occasionally, we get to vote on a bill or a particular law. But most of the time, you're born into a society where most of the rules are pretty much ahead of time. But the idea is the point of Rawls' thought experiment. If we can work through it in our minds, again, some people in this original position behind the veil of ignorance, what sort of society would they produce? And if we can envision that, we have envisioned society, and then we can strive to make our society match that. So the closer we come to that sort of society, the more we are. And what makes it just, again, is that in such a society, whatever obligations you had or limitations to your freedom you had would be voluntary, they would be self-imposed, right? Anyone who's rational and didn't already know that they were a billionaire or something would agree to this. That's the procedure. It's right, an interesting one. It's a nice sort of correction to Hobbes' account, right, by narrowing the scope down from morality to distributive justice, adding this veil of ignorance so that you don't end up with a situation where people, again, were minority groups or oppressed groups exploited by people that when you need to, make a deal with them. In the veil of ignorance, you might be in one of those groups. You better try to make a deal with them. So now we can speculate. Now that we know the procedure, what sort of world, right? What sort of system would this Rawls has some ideas about how it will turn out. It's an open question. You can argue with him and disagree. Uh, but for example, it's not at all clear that like the society that's produced would be a utilitarian one, right? For example, you've all taken this course. You know how demanding utilitarianism could be, right? And maybe you don't want to have to be put in a sort of problem situation where you'd have to pull the lever and kill your mom to save 5 people, right? You might build that into the original position and say, look, um, I don't want a society that maximizes happiness and makes everyone's happiness equal in that way. I want to carve out the possibility of special treatment for my loved ones. Like maybe, I want a society where when I die, all of my wealth isn't just split up evenly among all the, people in the United States, but instead I get to pass it to my children, right? And everyone in the original position, they don't know if they're going to have children or not, but they might say, yeah, being a human being, right? I do kind of have special feelings towards those close to me. I'd like to be able to direct whatever wealth I might have to those people. And so you might end up with a very non-utilitarian society from your original position. Um, you might end up with different societies depending on how risk averse people are, just psychologically, right? So if it turns out that everyone in the original position very aggressive and thinks, you know what, I'm going to work hard and I'm going to be smarter and better than everyone. You don't actually know if you are smarter or better than everyone, right? But maybe everyone has this bias, and you think, you know what, I'm gonna be the billionaire, right? So I want a total free market capitalist society, minimal taxes. Maybe everybody has that kind of confidence and aggression, right? Maybe, or maybe people are more risk averse, and so they're going to want a stronger social safety net. They're all more worried that they'll end up on the lower end of the socioeconomic scale. There's a range of outcomes that could be produced. It's not 100% clear which will be produced. But Rawls has some ideas, right? So um, he thinks there's two important principles that will come out, and they're in order of importance, right? First, he thinks that everyone will agree and insist on equality and the assignment of basic rights and duties, right? So he thinks that in the original position, everyone's to say things like, look, we should all have the freedom of speech. We should all have the right to bodily integrity, like that, right? We should all be required to pay taxes, whatever those taxes might be, and so on, right? So they think that people will decide on equality at a basic level. And then when it comes to distributing resources, however, he doesn't think that people will insist on uh, equality in that respect. Like, he doesn't think that people in the and all wealth, right, should be taxed and distributed equally so that everyone has the exact same amount of money. He doesn't think that will be the result. Instead, he thinks people are going to favor what we call a maximin strategy, right, where we uh, want to maximize the worst case scenario, right? So that is, we're going to choose a society. Everyone's not necessarily equal, but it's going to be a society where if there's any inequality, it it serves to boost the bottom, right? So you might imagine, and this is an empirical question of how economies work, right? You can imagine an economy where everything is split up equally, and maybe that doesn't spur innovation or cause people to want to like work hard since there's not really any reward to working harder. Your income just gets divided up anyways, right? Maybe a sort of a capitalist system uh, will spur innovation, will boost the whole economy, and the bottom rung will end up being better off than they would uh, equal society. That's possible, right? If that is the case, he thinks people will prefer that. People will prefer the best worst case, whatever that ends up being. Um, you might disagree with Rawls there, right? About human psychology and about how economies work, but that's at least his plan, and it's enough. So Rawls also offers us a way of assessing um, accounts of justice, right? And by this method, he's going to say his account of justice comes out pretty well. And this general way of assessing theories can be applied to ethics as well, right? We look back at many of the ethical theories we've studied and use this system of what he calls reflective equilibrium, right? So any theory he thinks can be assessed in two ways. First, you can look at the theory, in this case, his procedure for producing a just society, and evaluate whether it looks like it would produce the right. Is it right that the veil of ignorance is necessary, right? Um, and then you can sort of run the thought experiment, see what sort of society you think it would produce, and then ask yourself, does that society produce look fair to me, right? Or does it look like there's a problem? We've done this with utilitarianism, right? Utilitarianism sounds pretty good. Everybody counts equally, right? Happiness is the ultimate goal. But then we see that it produces some effects that we don't actually care for, right? Having to, again, your mom and the trolley problem and things like that, right? So for a theory to be good, it has to sort of look good at the theoretical level and also produce results or predictions, right, that on an intuitive level, right? Would Rawls's right procedure in the original position, would that produce results that we think we would like, or are we worried that it might produce, religious or racial discrimination or something like that? Will there be problems for future generations? Now, Rawls obviously thinks that his theory is successful on both fronts, right? He thinks that the theory is appealing, and also his projected results also sound fair. Remember, his projected results were equal rights and duties for all, and minimax approach, right? So this sort of approaching the problem from both sides and revising is needed. If you find some bad predictions, right, you can go back and revise your theory so it doesn't make predictions and repeat, right? Rinse and repeat. It calls this reflective equilibrium. So let's get into a little more detail on these two principles that he thinks his will produce, right? And this is the second part of reflective equilibrium, right? If we think that it will in fact produce the system, and if we think it looks good and looks fair, then that's further support for the higher level theory, right? So number one, each person is going to have an equal right to the most extensive basic liberty compatible with similar liberty for others. So this fleshes out this equality of rights and duties, right? What will the rights look like? What will the duties look like? Rawls thinks that we're going to want as many rights as possible, the broadest palette of rights, right? As long as it doesn't interfere with other people's rights. You can't have a general right to kill people, right? Because that's incompatible with another right to people's, bodily integrity, right? So if you want, you can't have both of those rights, right? So you're only going to pick the right that everyone can have. You're not going to have a right to everyone's property, but you can have a right to some property, your own property, and so on. And then the second part, which I discussed, the minimax account, there can be inequalities, social and economic inequalities, right? So long as they are to everyone's advantage, right? Which means compared to systems, right, where you are on the bottom. Well, if there's a system where the bottom is a bit higher, then we'll go with that one, right? And even if that system allows some people to be much richer than you, well, you were better off, your bottom is higher than it would have been otherwise. And secondly, part B, these goods that are distributed that might be unequal are going to be attached to positions and offices that are open to all, right? So everyone has a chance to make more money, right? No one is barred from a position that would make them more money. Of course, there will be competition for the better jobs, but that's natural, he thinks. So he thinks these two principles capture the most important things about a just society, which is rights and resources. Right? How do we distribute rights? How do we distribute resources? His answer to how we distribute rights is give everyone as many rights as possible, so long as they don't conflict with each other, with other people's rights. So, freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of religion, freedom to vote, freedom to run to office. That's not going to infringe on anyone else's rights, and so we should all have those. And the second principle is the maximum principle that we've talked about. So whatever distribution makes for the best worst case, that's the one. In the original position, thinking, well, maybe I'll be rich, maybe I'll be poor, but I want to ensure that if I'm poor, I'm is still in as best of a possible situation as I can be. Right? Even if that means there's some limit to how rich I can get. Right? There's some sort of taxation on the rich. And this is making certain assumptions about human psychology. It assumes that people are basically risk averse. Again, you might in the original position have a bunch of gamblers who say, I want the society where the highest is as high as possible, and I don't care what happens on the bottom, right? Dreams, It seems that Rawls is right, that, empirically people are more risk averse, right? But again, that doesn't mean that perfect equality is the inevitable outcome that he thinks. We're going to go for the minimum, for the maximum. So the second part of that second principle about how, right, these goods are distributed, right, even if they're distributed unequally, is that the amount of goods you get is going to be attached to what sort of office you hold. By office, I mean jobs. And he wants those to be open to everyone. So long as everyone at least has a chance to be a president or a CEO of Microsoft or whatever it is, then he thinks people will accept that, and that's what they're going to create in the original position. So in that sort of society, even if you're born poor, you're as well off as you could possibly be at the bottom, right? Because of the maximum strategy, and you will have a chance to improve your situation, right, by moving up. He thinks that these principles, the one about the rights, is more important than the other. So you can't have a distribution that violates people's rights. Right? The one about the rights and duties is by far the most important one. And the second one, the distribution, has to be compatible with that distribution of rights. But I think we get the idea, right? The system allows you to give up some of your liberties, just as Hobbes. That's the nature of the social contract, according to Hobbes. Right? You give up some of your rights in exchange for some benefit. So that's what this is doing precisely. But it does it in a way that doesn't leave certain groups totally disadvantaged because of the veil of ignorance. So, I've covered this, right? The maximum, right, strategy is a reasonable strategy if you have theory, right? This is a very common strategy in decision making under complete uncertainty, and it does seem to match empirically, right? Not everyone. Some people are gamblers. In the original position, you think you're going to get more risk-averse people. Now, some theorists have argued against Rawls' prioritization of the rights and duties. That first step is inviolable, and any distribution of resources has to be compatible with that set of rights. Because people have argued, look, if you don't have enough money to eat, rights aren't going to matter much to you. Right? So maybe we should guarantee a certain level of economic security first before we start talking about people's rights. Because if you're starving, that seems to be the most pressing issue. Right? So that's a fair point. Something someone could respond to in a paper. Not too late to change your paper if you find Nozick or Rawls very interesting, right? And you're dissatisfied with your draft. Your final paper doesn't have to look like your draft. Typically they do, right? Because that's the point of the procedure, right? But people change it up all the time at the last minute and end up writing a good paper that's very different from what they originally thought they would. So feel free to talk to me if you have any ideas about writing about Rawls or Nozick and had any questions about how to do that. I'm happy to talk to you in office hours. So I will see you next time.